Okay, hi everybody. My name is Lynn Hublow, and I am a lecturer in the English department at South Dakota State, teaching composition. I want to welcome everybody to the South Dakota Humanities Council's Festival of Books. This is always an exciting time. I want to go through a few housekeeping details with you. We're going to have an open mic at the end of this, and so if you want to ask questions, you can. We'll just unmute at the end after about 20 minutes or so, and then you can ask questions of Penn herself. Make sure that you feel free to go to the Virtual Exhibitors Hall event on the South Dakota Humanities Council Facebook page, where you can learn about authors, the publications, cultural organizations, and you can even win some prizes, so that's exciting too. You can buy books from the presenting authors at Zambros Variety at their online festival bookstore, and that is at zambros.com. You'll find buttons at the southdakotafestival.com website that will take you directly to the booksellers, and we'll have links for that too. Please make sure too that you fill out an evaluation form following this presentation, and I will have a link for that in chat, which of course is at the bottom of your screen. You can see the bubble there. Finally, you can help keep the festival free by making a tax-deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. Visit the website sdhumanities.org. And there are so many generous donors who give to the South Dakota Humanities Council, and you can see those donors on the back of your guide. So let's get on with this program, and this one is called The Historical Novel and Literary License in Bloomsbury's Late Rose. And our presenter today is Penn Pearson, and Penn is the author of the historical novel Bloomsbury's Late Rose and 2 books of poetry. She is a professor of English at Northern State University, where she teaches creative writing and American literature. Originally from Sioux City, Iowa, Pearson holds an MA in English from SDSU and a PhD in English from USD. She is the director of A Writer Reads, a series that brings at least 2 visiting writers to NSU's campus annually, and she is the advisor to Northern Lights, NSU's student literary magazine. Good to have you here, Penn, and you can take it away.
All right, Penn, just gonna try to help you here real quick. You see at the bottom left of your screen where it says mute, there's an arrow right next to it, and it says select a microphone. It should just be your built-in microphone. So let me know if you Yeah, still aren't hearing you at all. Which is great, of course. We tested it. Maybe we could have you leave the session and rejoin. Maybe that'll work. Oh, wait.
Is it working now?
Yeah, we're getting sound all of a sudden.
Okay, great. I just tested it. it and it worked. Okay, are we ready? Can everybody hear me now? Nod your head if your video's on. Fabulous. Okay, love technical difficulties. Okay, so welcome to my presentation, which is the historical novel and literary license in Bloomsbury's Late Rose. What I'd like to do is talk a bit about my approach to my novel, then address the historical record, the facts of the historical record I adhered to, a couple of literary license I took, couple of points of literary license I took, and then finally talk about the larger concerns I had when writing the novel or approaching the novel that I kept in mind when drafting and revising. As Lynn had said, my novel, Bloomsbury Late Rose, is about the personal life and professional career of real life poet Charlotte Mew, a British poet who lived from 1869 to 1928. My aim with the novel was to resurrect her knowledge about her life and her career, but particularly invite prose readers to take a closer look at her work. The reason for my goal was that Mew has largely fallen out of the canon, even though Thomas Hardy predicted in the 20s that she would be read when her contemporaries had been forgotten. So my approach to the novel in general began with the research. First through poetry. I myself am more of a poet than a prose writer. And I fell in love with Mew's poetry when I was a master's student at SDSU and had to write a critical thesis. I chose Mew because I loved her poetry. She writes fabulous lyrics, fabulous dramatic monologues, and she does so by inventing, or I should say, experimenting with form in such a way that her poems are both conversational at the same time that they rhyme. And they deal with great issues of death and love, and particularly within that, untimely death or romantic love that is unrequited. I moved on and I read the one book-length biography of her by Penelope Fitzgerald, which was written and published in the 80s. And then I looked at, I actually traveled to London. I visited her haunts, including her childhood home in Bloomsbury, the home she lived as most of her adult life, also in Bloomsbury, and finally the apartment or flat, as they say, that she lived finally. I also took a look at her letters in the bird collection of the New York Public Library. They were very telling in terms of voice, also in terms of her relationships with writers such as Mason Clare. And then I also read a number of historical novels by other writers that focused on poets or playwrights, including The Fall of Frost about Robert Frost, Wintering by, about Sylvia Plath, and then Author about Henry James Biddet being a playwright. And then last, I also read books about the craft of fiction, just so that I could dramatize her story for prose readers. And after doing that research, I really decided to focus my book on the unlikelihood of Charlotte Mew having been widely read and critically acclaimed in the 20s because of all the personal and professional obstacles she faced, both growing up maturing, and then finally coming of age, I'll say, in the 50s. And that, by the way, is why I titled the book Bloomsbury's Late Rose, to indicate, one, that she was a resident of Bloomsbury the entirety of her life. Two, roses were a common motif in her poetry. And last, I count her as a late bloomer in that even though she started writing in her 20s, she didn't get notice until her 40s, and then finally her 50s, and then particularly for her poetry. So in terms of the historical record, in a sense, it was easy to write the book because Mew's life itself was dramatic. So I was mostly faithful to the historical record in crafting her story as a novel, with a couple of exceptions that I'll talk about in a moment when I talk about literary license. That included the historical record, the facts of the historical record included the institutionalization of her brother Henry and her sister Frida for schizophrenia. The pact she made with her sister Anne to never marry, because they knew if they married and had children, it was very likely that they would pass on the schizophrenia to their own children. Also, the unhappiness of her parents' marriage, or Anne and Charlotte's parents' marriage, largely because the mother, who goes mostly by Ma in the book, what Anne and Charlotte called her, thought that she had married beneath herself. As well, the Mew women's genteel poverty. Once Fred Mew died of cancer. They lived in a house on Gordon Square in Bloomsbury, but they eventually let more and more of the rooms of that house to boarders or tenants in order to make ends meet. Also, her lesbianism and her dalliances with writers Ella D'Arcy and May Sinclair, those are all part of the historical record. And then also her slow rise, slow but eventual rise to literary acclaim, and popularity in the 20s. And just at large, to all of the major characters who appear in the book are real, including characters that / people who helped Charlotte Mew in her career, including Thomas Hardy, including Sidney Cockrell, including Alida and Henry Monroe, including Sappho, also known as Mrs. Scott. Even minor characters such as Weck, Ma's parrot, are real. They're part of the historical record. I did take literary license in 2 cases, which I do acknowledge in the author's note. One, I imagined that Anne, Charlotte's sister, might have had a romantic interest in a man. And largely because I thought, well, given human nature, it was plausible that she would have some sort of love interest. And just like Charlotte had. The reason I imagined that as well was because it honestly helped the novel. The sisters had made the pact. I imagine that Charlotte felt in her dalliances with Ella D'Arcy and May Sinclair that she was maybe violating the spirit of that pact, even though she hadn't married. And I wondered how that tension, created by the pact and Charlotte's violation might feed into the drama. And along with that is that idea that they never talked about the pact between themselves. They never talked about, Charlotte never addressed her lesbianism with Anne. And Anne never addressed her interest in this fictional character that I invented, Mr. Anthony. One other event, not person, but event I invented was Frida's health scare that led Charlotte to travel to Whitecroft Hospital, where Frida was institutionalized on the Isle of Wight, to comfort her, to be by her side. I did acknowledge those little bit of literary license that I took, or a lot, maybe in some people's view, in my author's notes. I thought that was important, okay, in being at least largely true to not just the historical record, but to the memory of Charlotte Mew and in honor of her life. And lastly, in regard to literary license, I did play a bit with the identity, say, of the tenants. So one tenant, Mr. Boynton, is fictional. Yes, the Muse had tenants. There's not a lot of information about their identities. So I invented Mr. Boynton's character, and he is a tenant in the book. I also invented some scenes with him, such as his losing his teeth, and they're finding them in Ma's cup over tea. So some concerns I had as I was writing the novel, issues that came to the fore for me, included readers' expectations for an historical novel. You know, how much would they allow in terms of literary license, you know, given the genre? I think it's interesting to note that even though this is a historical novel, and more specifically a biographical novel, so historical novel about a real life person, focused on a real life person, there is a legal disclaimer, okay, in the book on the copyright page that reads, this novel, although based on the life of Charlotte Mew, is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locales is entirely coincidental. Okay, so I would argue with that. It was not quite coincidental that, for instance, I dramatized the pact between the sisters, which is part of the historical record. So that was something I had in mind, though. You know, how much facts, how many facts do the readers expect when they're reading, you know, a historical novel? You know, how much literary license is allowed? I also thought a lot about just the genre conventions of fiction. Our lives are very messy. They only seem to make sense in hindsight, and sometimes not even then. And yet, when we tell somebody's life story, you know, when you dramatize it in a novel or a biopic, you know, such as a movie on TV, we make it seem as if, you know, events led undeniably to other events, and that there's some sort of coherent character development in terms of an emotional arc. That I think is unavoidable. So even though I think that her life did lend itself to dramatization, just because of, you know, all that she faced personally and professionally, nonetheless, I think that finally it's fitting that it's called a novel, okay, instead of, you know, a biography or history. On that note, to my mind, not to the same degree, but even a biography such as Penelope Fitzgerald's biography of Charlotte Mew, you know, is, though fact-based, subjective. I mean, what Fitzgerald chose to include, what she chose to emphasize, and even the fact that she herself, you know, told about Mew, her background, her life as a poet, you know, as a story. So that gave me some comfort that subjectivity, regardless of the genre, okay, is necessary. And couple last points. I think that my love of Mew, I loved her poetry, I read her story, I fell in love with Mew herself. I think necessarily biased my treatment of her in the novel. I do acknowledge that she could be cantankerous as I dramatize her. I do acknowledge or dramatize the fact that she was sort of a very nervous, high-strung person who was maybe even paranoid about other people's reactions to her. But I think largely my portrayal is positive. Yes, according to the historical record, she was fiercely loyal to her friends. And so that was easy to dramatize her as such and dramatize her in a positive light. And she had many good characteristics. Last of all, I thought a lot about point of view. And some of the other historical novels I read, you know, focused on, say, famous artists such as Sylvia Plath. The writers of those historical novels elected to use first-person point of view. And I just couldn't bring myself to do that. That seemed to make too many, you know, to be too presumptuous and too intimate. I mean, I just couldn't assume that close of association with Mew that I would speak, you know, in her voice. So I settled on third person, limited and omniscient. So the story is told largely from her point of view. The reader is privy to Mew's thoughts and feelings. At the same time, they're given secondhand. You know, we drop into her thoughts, we drop into her feelings or her mind and heart, but she's not delivering them herself. And I'm not being critical. I don't mean to criticize other authors who choose to do differently, but for me, that was just important to use the third person, limited versus first person. So those are some of the concerns I had as I was conceptualizing, drafting, and revising the novel. I would be really, really interested to hear your thoughts on the historical novel and literary license, okay, or your questions on Bloomsbury's Late Rose as a historical novel, and anything I've said. So please go ahead and talk if you have comments or questions.
I have a question that isn't really about the historical novel, but I'm not familiar with this poet. If you could tell us a little bit about her poetry and what she wrote about, that would be very enlightening.
I will do one better, Lynn, and I will actually read one of her shorter poems, a lyric poem. It'll give you a good flavor of her work. Fame. Sometimes in the overheated house, but not for long, smirking and speaking rather loud, I see myself among the crowd, where no one fits the singer to a song, or sifts the unpainted from the painted faces of the people who are always on my stare. They were not with me when I walked in heavenly places, but could I spare in the blind earth's great silences and spaces, the din, the scuffle, the long stare. If I went back and it was not there, back to the old known things that are the new, the folded glory of the gorse, the sweet briar air, to the larks that cannot praise us, knowing nothing of what we do, and the divine wise trees that do not care. Yet to leave fame still with such eyes and that bright hair, God, if I might, and before I go hence, take in her stead to our dossed bed, one little dream, no matter how small, how wild. Just now, I think I found it in a field, under a fence, a frail, dead, newborn lamb, ghostly and pitiful and white, a blot upon the night, the moon's dropped child. I think that that poem exemplifies in many ways the body of Mew's work, the tension between wanting something and not getting it. Fame personified is a good thing, but also a bad thing. Her use of the countryside, its imagery to discuss a theme, and also the metaphor at the end of the lamb, you know, and it's being the moon's dropped child. That's one of her lyric poems. She's also known for her dramatic monologues, such as Madeline in Church, wherein a unrepentant woman, okay, who's carried on with numerous men, talks to a plaster saint and explains why she won't repent. And that poem captures the tension, that conflict, I think Charlotte felt between her religious upbringing in the Anglican Church and her identity as a lesbian. I think she was beleaguered by a sense of shame over her sexuality. At the same time, I think she was driven by it. Her dalliances, I'll call them, with Ella D'Arcy and May Sinclair had the hallmarks of obsessiveness. They were unrequited, but Charlotte, you know, threw herself headlong into them. And so I think that that theme of sexuality or sensuality versus, say, religion and its, you know, dictums, particularly for women, was central to her poems, such as in Madeline Church, but, you know, from that, I assumed also central to her life. Great question. Thanks, Lynn.
You're welcome. If people would like, you can also submit questions in chat if you don't want to express your question out loud.
I have a question for Penn. Was there anything in Mew's life that you felt that was like you wanted to use in the book, but it just didn't work out? And like is there any part of your book that you wish that you might have changed just a little bit?
That is an excellent question, Emma. I might have to think about that a bit. There were things in her life that I found, facts in her life that I found very interesting, that could have been further developed in the book, but because of my focus, I either minimized or left out entirely. For example, or to explain, the book begins after the prologue, which is set in 1894. The book begins in 1909 when Mew is approaching her 40th birthday, and it ends in 1928 with her death. In that time frame, I also include flashbacks of her past. including her brush with fame in the 1890s as a fiction writer. I give that scant treatment, and I use it mostly to show or demonstrate that in my mind, she was always interested in achieving fame, perhaps in part to negate, kind of offset her feelings of shame or guilt. So it was a way, I think fame maybe was a way for her to redeem herself. So I use it to help dramatize that theme, and but I don't go into, you know, a lot of details, you know, scene by scene in that part of her life, you know, because of the focus of the novel. And I don't go into her stories. And her oeuvre of short fiction, which she wrote largely in the 90s, is remarkable. And in many ways, it correlates with the poems, and in many ways, the stories really stand apart by themselves. So that's one, I just had to put that, you know, aside because it just wasn't part of my work's focus. But I don't think in putting it aside, I neglected anything, you know, too important. And once again, I do address it. I just don't make it a central feature, okay, of the novel. Thanks, Emma. I see Steve Wingate has a question. Comment and question. One of the pleasures of writing historical novels is exploring the resonance between that historical period and the present. What elements of that era did you feel rejected in today? What elements of that era did you feel rejected in today, reflected in today? That's interesting. That's an interesting question. Could you talk a little bit more about that, Steve? You're interested in that idea of, you know, talking about the present through the past?
Yeah, well, when we are, there's always an interplay because we are people of our contemporary times, looking back at a time that was not ours. So it's kind of comes with the territory that we're going to bring our emotional take on life back into the past. And it also goes with the territory that when we're writing about the past, we're, from our present perspective, we're kind of bringing with us our own impression of how we got from the past to the present. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It does, and I think that goes to those, you know, broader issues that I said concern me as I was conceptualizing and drafting the novel. How much, for instance, was I projecting, you know, onto Muse life, because I had the benefit of the historical record, you know, looking at history, you know, or looking at the past, you know, through the eyes of history, as it were. Once again, you know, our lives are messy, and yet if we, you know, put them into narrative, whether a novel or obituary, sometimes they, you know, look as if they could have been a novel, for instance. More to the point, I think, is another issue that I think your question raised, and that is how much of our own autobiography, you know, becomes part, you know, of our historical novel, or in this case, the biographical novel. And, you know, I can say a lot of my own autobiography, you know, lent itself to me. I mean, that's why I was attracted to her work and the story of her personal life, is because I had so much in common with her. And in turn, you know, key differences. I mean, for instance, I come from a family whose parents weren't very happily married. There were 4 of us kids. One of the 4 of us had a heart condition. So there was always special attention paid to him because of that, you know, much like Frida and Henry were singled out because of their mental illness. Then by contrast, and this is also interesting, what's different was her identity, her identification as lesbian, which is not my identification, but I was able to explore it, I thought, you know, given what I imagined and knew and imagined to be the constraints, you know, against other, you know, sexuality such as lesbianism, you know, in that age. And then moreover, her obsessiveness, you know, in her love affairs, you know, even though they were unrequited, maybe because of her obsessiveness in them, was something that I understood just because of, you know, some of the relations I've had. So once again, I lent, you know, a lot of my autobiography, I think, in telling Mu's story. And maybe that's inevitable, and regardless of, you know, what we write, you know, despite, you know, whether it be a historical novel or something else. Thanks for that question, Steve. Pam asked, what advice would you give to someone who wants to write a historical novel about a real person? First and foremost, I would suggest that if you have aspirations to publish your book with a commercial publisher, you know, one of the big 5 or one of their imprints, choose someone who has a bigger presence than, say, a minor poet from the early 20th century who most people have forgotten. Because I learned through, you know, pitching my novel to agents and publishers that they were more interested, biographical novels or historical novels, you know, generally are huge right now. And so they're eager to find those and publish them. However, they're looking for novels about people with, you know, household names that are, you know, have household recognition. You know, and I think of just some of the novels, you know, the ones I mentioned, for example, you know, big writers, you know, like Robert Frost or Henry James or Sylvia Plath. Also just figures, you know, such as Hadley Hemingway, or, you know, somebody who was closely associated with somebody who was great and that people might be familiar with, or Anne Lindbergh, you know, in telling their story, dramatizing their story, you know, in the historical novel. So if you have commercial aspirations, if you're happy to work with an independent publisher like I did when working with, you know, Chickadee Prints published my book, very happy working with them. They don't have the marketing resources, obviously, that commercial publishers do. What it did allow me, though, was the opportunity to write about someone I loved, you know, with the aim of maybe introducing her to prose writers or readers in general who had never heard of Charlotte Mew. So, you know, consider like where you want to publish the work and, you know, what your end goal is. That would be the primary advice I would give. And just one second point of advice I'd give is to find maybe someone for whom there's a biography has been written, because that made my research maybe less direct, but certainly easier being able to read the biography by Penelope Fitzgerald and using that as a resource in dramatizing Mew's story. Thanks, Pam. Other questions or comments? What do you guys think of the historical novel as a genre? Do you read it? What are your expectations for it in terms of literary license? Is that all good?
Hi, Penn. It's Danielle. I just wanted to say that I just have so much respect for you, of course, and for everybody who like decides to write a historical novel just because of like the amount of time and research and effort and precision that it takes, and honestly amazes me. So, like, good job.
Thanks, Danielle. I had so much fun writing it. It was a labor of love. It took me 6 years to write, another 2 years to find a publisher after I'd gotten an agent, and then another year to edit it for publication. So it was, and if you consider that I met Charlotte Mew in 1994 when I was looking for a topic for my critical thesis, you could say this wasn't just a 10-year project. This was actually a let's see, do the math quickly, a 25-year project. Because I knew even when I wrote the critical thesis that I wanted to do something more, with her story, with her poetry. So it was a lot of fun. Other thoughts or questions?
There is a chat question.
Ooh, okay, good. Let's take a look. Okay, from Cindy to everyone. It's my favorite genre. I tend to assume that there is literary license taken to compress timelines and characters. I enjoy the fiction for a work on its own, but then I do tend to go and do research to see how the work meets and deviates from the historical record. Thank you for this interesting talk and your time and insight. Okay, thanks very much, Cindy. Yes, isn't it, that's part of the fun of, watching, a movie about someone or reading a book about someone who really existed, okay, is to contrast the book or compare it, as it were, with the historical record and see, what literary license was taken. I just heard the other night, someone was, a film critic was talking about the movie Amadeus, and they said actually Salieri was not the despicable character he's made out to be. He had issues certainly with Mozart, but his actions weren't so grievous. And I thought about that, and I'm not sure how I feel ultimately about, maybe characterizing him as the adversary of Mozart, for the sake of a successful film. On the other hand, I love that movie, and it's not going to stop me from liking it. So to me, that just adds that, that information from the point of view of a film critic who had done research into music, just added another layer, to the film, to my experience of that film. Okay, this is a great question. Has her family reacted to your book? Do they agree with your choices? I have not heard from anyone, including, I should say, I haven't heard from any relatives or anyone else who has a close association with Mew and her story. So it would be interesting to hear from someone. And maybe the onus is on me to distribute my book to certain parties and, see what they think. I think one disadvantage is that, this is, this book is published by American publisher and directed at an American audience. And so I think my ultimate goal for the book would have it be republished, in Great Britain, specifically England, because I think, one, there'd be a larger readership for it. And two, I think it would be really interesting to hear from a British audience, in terms of my, treatment of Mew, who they, a poet they might be more familiar with. And also just in terms of, my Americanisms, as it were, okay, in writing the book. That said, if a British publisher comes knocking and wants to republish it, most likely they would have copy editors who might, change some of those Americanisms to Britishisms, either in terms of contemporary language use or maybe more exactly historical language use. Great question. Thank you.
This has been just a wonderful presentation, Penn. Thank you so much for piquing our interest about your novel. I think all of us want to read it. So with that, I think it's time to wind up. And all of you people who attended, please remember to fill out the evaluation form. There was a link in chat. And thanks again, Penn. It was just great to see you.
Thank you. And thank everybody else.